Welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Albert Cho. South Korea President Yoon has been to the U.S. for a summit with U.S. President Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida. Is this move a signal to Beijing and Pyongyang? Will this meeting safeguard Taiwan's security, or might it further infuriate the People's Liberation Army? Joining us today are David Arase, Johns Hopkins SAIS, resident professor of international politics, and Chen-shen, professor of foreign policy at the National Chengchi University. A very warm welcome to both on the show. Okay. Biden welcomes Yoon and Kishida in Camp David. There are several objectives for this meeting. Firstly, enhancing early warning missile launch detection, particularly against North Korea's ballistic missile and nuclear threats. Trilateral joint military drills with a focus on anti-submarine warfare, the establishment of a crisis hotline among the three nations, and diplomatically, a premier joint statement of principles that lays out their collective priorities. So first question goes to Professor Arase. So what's your overall thoughts on this summit in the United States?
Well, this is really a very important development. It's the creation of a three-way, trilateral strategic partnership between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. And it's dedicated not only to stability on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia, but it's also dedicated to the stability and security and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific. So this is really unprecedented, and it happened very quickly. The key question now is whether this very significant strategic development can be put on a lasting foundation that will persist through future elections, presidential elections, changes of governments in all three countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Professor Yin, so what's your further observation of this summit? Any kind of priorities that stands out, as significant to you?
Well, I think first of all, for the three countries, U.S. has a bilateral security alliance, tie with Japan. U.S. has one with Korea, but Korea and Japan doesn't have a security pact. So this is the first time, that they are officially in the same group together outside a, we call, kind of a side meeting in a summit that they meet. Right? So this is significant. Second one is, of course, I think this is a strong reaction to North Korea, and especially if you have being a company at the same time, you have the U.S. ships going around there in the Korean Peninsula with the nuclear capability. I think this is all focusing on the stability of Korean Peninsula. I think that's the priority. But also Indo-Pacific, like Professor Arase said, Taiwan Strait, that would be also on the table as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Professor Arase, if we compare the existing mechanism like Quad, would you kind of compare the two, or the summit, or any kind of outputs that comes out of the summit?
Yeah, this is very significant because what it does is it creates a very strong strategic anchor in Northeast Asia, whereas Quad covers the entire region. Mm. And so the focus really, the primary focus is on Northeast Asia. Next is the Taiwan Strait. After that, it's the South China Sea. And after that, it's the Pacific Islands.
Okay, so would it be accurate to suggest that, as some media reports that this is the inception of a mini NATO? Maybe Professor Yin.
Well, last time when you have the NATO summit, I think, you have reporters from Korea, from Japan, asking the question. Basically, in the NATO, we call paper coming out of at the end that you didn't mention about the setting up a office in Japan, and then the Korean reporter, I still remember, asking about whether Korea, Japan will be invited to the next NATO, and that one was not answered. So I'm not sure this is going to be the case. Right now, I think David made a very good point. It's about whether you have a kind of institutionalized mechanism, but can it survive presidential election, both in the U.S. and in Korea? Japan, I don't have any doubt. But Korea, you always have a left-wing government coming up which has, maybe a better relation with China, maybe have a different approach with North Korea. So that, I don't know whether you can survive that type of, Yoon is, term limit. Basically, every Korean president, is term limit. So the first term is the last term. So whatever he can do right now, only if his party won the next election, maybe we can see the continuation. But if the left wing came back to power, who knows?
Okay, Professor Arase, do you agree with Professor Yan's assessment? This is not a mini NATO.
No, it's not. And as Professor Yan said earlier, that there is no formal alliance agreement between Korea and Japan. Secondly, NATO really is a bloc. It's a bloc alliance. In other words, there's a unified military command structure. There's a NATO political assembly. It's a very strong institution. In this case, it's basically the U.S. and its two allies agreeing to stronger strategic cooperation, and that's all.
Okay. The potential for trilateral military alliances is not without its complications. As Professor Yan mentioned, Korea was colonized by Japan for many years. Why is Korea now open to collaboration with Japan? Professor
Well,
Yan?
right now, it's like all those conservative regimes before in Korea, you find their approach to Japan is more conciliatory. But the left-wing government has a different thinking. Sometimes, especially if they want to have a kind of reconciliation with North Korea, which Japan worry a lot. So this is one area I think Japan and Korea will have difficulty. Sometimes when they have this historical problem, the comfort women issues, the forced labor issue during World War II. Japan is frustrated sometimes. They felt they have apologized. They have paid some kind of indemnity before, but then suddenly, because maybe certain politician didn't, show remorse, and then suddenly South Korea protests again, and then you need to redo. So this is off and on things. Maybe under President Yoon, it's not going to happen, but you never know about the Korean students. They might come up with some kind of protest in the future.
Professor Arase, where does the President Yoon stand on this matter towards Japan and also the part of the colonial history?
I think Yoon believes that the moon diplomacy, not just toward North Korea but toward China, was a failure, and that South Korea needs to move in a different direction, a new direction, because the existential threats that the South faces from the North and from China are unprecedented, complicated, and only turning more strongly to the U.S. and its allies will actually be a long-term solution for South Korea.
That's political elite. What about the civil society? Has the sentiments against Japan in South Korea diminished or even vanished?
It's diminishing. It's diminishing, yes. For the past 2 years, the trends are toward reconciliation. And meanwhile, since 2015, the public sentiment toward China has had a dramatic reversal. In 2015, only about 37% of the South Korean public viewed China in a negative light. But today it's 81%, and that's the highest in the world. With regard to Japan, the negative perception of Japan has gone down to 50%, and 30% now view Japan positively. And for Japan, about 40% have a negative perception, but 30% have a positive perception. But the point is that the trends are moving in a positive direction for those two, and in a negative direction vis-a-vis China.
Okay, yeah, that's the reality. We also should address the geopolitical implications. Let's consider Taiwan and put Taiwan in the map now. Japan and Taiwan form part of the first island chain, situated directly opposite China. Australia, on the other hand, is strategically located at the intersections of the second and third island chain. In the event of a PLA offensive against Taiwan, Australia could potentially function as a military resupply base for Taiwan. So can you offer a geopolitical assessment of the Korea-Japan-US alliance and the role Taiwan might play within this framework. Professor Yan first.
Okay, if you look at the map, Taiwan is in the middle of this specific, so-called the chain here, the island chain here. So if China took Taiwan, I think every country's geographic, geostrategic consideration will be totally different. So this is almost like a gap between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia that U.S. somehow has to maintain, has to make sure that China will not have a breakthrough here. So Taiwan, just like when I was growing up 60 years ago, that you have a saying that Taiwan is an unsinkable aircraft carrier and that is strategically important. Today, the same asset is still here, but also because of this, that China is more determined to take Taiwan. So in this way, in Northeast Asia, both Japan and Korea, in Southeast Asia, I think the Philippines and other U.S. allies, Australia and New Zealand, in the South Pacific, they will always be concerned. I think that's the only one of the good things about Taiwan's geographic location is people do care. A growing China, with a lot of military capacities that might be threatening to the regional stability, and then Taiwan is an important part of this we call containment.
Professor Arase, is Taiwan really an unsinkable aircraft carrier, to your perspective?
Well, not really for any strategic power. The U.S. doesn't use it as an aircraft carrier, neither does China. But China wants to use it as a strategic aircraft carrier.
Okay, vice versa.
Yeah, and geopolitically, Taiwan sits in between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. And so it's critical to the security of both subregions. And that's why the two triangles, that is the Northeast Asian triangle of the U.S., Japan, and Korea, and the southern triangle of the U.S., Japan, and Australia are concerned about security in the Taiwan Strait because it affects the security of both regions. And that's why Taiwan is not going to be a direct party to these strategic arrangements, but it is the joint strategic concern of both triangles, of both subregions, to ensure that peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is maintained because it affects both subregions.
Okay, yeah. All right, Taiwan cannot be simply seen as a nation under the protective umbrella of US and Japan. Recently, there has been a noticeable uptick in Taiwan's own military preparation. What measures should Taiwan adopt to support the potential Korea-Japan-US military alliance, be it directly or indirectly? And now we are kind of delve deeper into Taiwan's preparation. Maybe Professor Yan, you go first.
If Taiwan is part of the consideration, I think it would not, Korea will never join this kind of alliance that Japan and U.S. try to form, including Taiwan's security interests in there, because I think Korea will consider China's, objection of this, so that would not be the case. So we cannot expect anything from Korea. But in terms of Japan, I think they follow what United States did. So the most important thing for Taiwan is to make sure if there's any kind of military threat to Taiwan, it is not because of what we have done something that we have unilaterally changed the status quo. We have been provocative. If we are not, then if China is provocative and China uses military force against Taiwan, there is a greater reason for U.S. to intervene more aggressively. And once the U.S. intervenes, Japan probably will follow up. But if you depend on Japan to unilaterally help Taiwan, I think that would be too, not realistic.
Okay, still, I wonder, isn't any room left over there for a collaboration between Taiwan and South Korea against China, Professor Arase?
Against Taiwan and South Korea cooperation?
Yeah, cooperation against China.
Not in any military strategic sense, perhaps in a diplomatic and political area, or economically to enhance economic security against coercion. But I think that the key here is that Korea, Japan, and the U.S. Want to maintain peace and stability in Taiwan Strait, and they admire the democracy that's been established here, and the way Taiwan has flourished under free civil institutions, economic institutions, and political institutions. So it's not just a military strategic matter, it's also a matter of defending a so-called rules-based order in the region.
Right. Let's put a question in a different way. What factors, concrete factors, to both scholars, might make the Korean government reluctant to militarily support Taiwan? You mentioned some of them, but how should Taiwan, work to address those apprehensions?
Okay, first of all, I think the bilateral trade between China and Korea is the largest for Korea. Korea's international trade used to be number one would be U.S. or Japan, but now it's always China, even though the percentage is down, but still number one. Okay, so that's very important. And secondly, if you don't go up, if you somehow irritate China, who knows? China might, encourage North Korea to do something. So I think South Korea, in this kind of triangle supporting Taiwan, it would be very limited. Economically, yes, we might have some room for cooperation, but we have been competitive for so long. We don't have that culture of cooperation. In terms of electronic, the high-tech industry, we are competitive. We started from competitor from the textile industry, from the footwear industry, all the way up to the steel industry and almost everything. So I'm not sure there exists a culture of kind of, complementarity or cooperation. That's the big problem.
Do you agree?
No, I don't. So I believe the latest trade figures show that South Korea's trade with the U.S. is now greater than trade with China. The trends are moving, I think under President Yoon, South Korea has decided that its economic future is not tied to China. China, in fact, is a threat to its long-term technology, economy, and long-term viability. So it needs to then turn now to the U.S. and its allies to strengthen more sort of win-win, mutually beneficial relations. And here is where Taiwan has to work with South Korea, for example, in a chip alliance or in other areas, so that Taiwan and South Korea can help each other, meet the threat of coercion or meet the threat of the erosion of their technological advantages, and to open up channels and tie themselves more closely to the rich, innovative economies of the U.S. and its allies.
Okay, in a similar vein, could you discuss the strengths and challenges inherent in the Taiwan-Japan relationship? We talk about South Korea, but now Japan.
I think Japan and Korea and Taiwan's relation is much easier to foster because of the tradition of friendship for quite a long time. And then also Japan is closer to Taiwan. I think it felt the Chinese threat to the Taiwan Strait more imminent than Korea, a little bit more. So we have a lot of informal relations with Japan. You have former Prime Minister coming to Taiwan a lot. So this is a different kind of relation than with Korea. Korea, in Taiwan, I think, people still remember, some of the older generation still remember the 1990 breakup. That was not very good in Taiwan. And then, in the past 30 years, in Taiwan, people felt that we have been overtaken by Korea in terms of GDP per capita. So that's not a good feeling in Taiwan. So in a way, we have always been behind Japan in terms of the economic development. But when someone was catching up and overtaking you, it's difficult for Taiwan to swallow. So that's why I always felt when I talk to Taiwan's business people that there is still kind of a little bit animosity between Taiwan and Korea.
Professor, you are a scholar from Taiwan. we talk a little bit about the anti-Japan sentiments in the Taiwanese society a bit. Do we still have a lot of people like that in Taiwan now?
Well, I think the older generation from mainland China might have, but the younger generation, I think, have less, much less. And if you look at the number one travel tourist destination, it's always Japan. So that's not a big problem right now. I think the problem is still, we have young people going to Korea. People like the K-pop and everything, but the middle-aged people, when you talk about them, Korea, and then people begin to remember we lost the baseball game to Korea, we lost the basketball game. So there's a lot of that kind of psychological things that cannot be overcome.
What about you, Professor Arase? The strengths and challenges between Taiwan and Japan?
Well, I think the people of Taiwan and the people of the mainland have a different experience of Japanese imperialism. And this colors their thinking, even down to today. I think the people of Taiwan, in general, have today, in terms of the relations, have very strong cultural, social relations, very strong business partnerships, very strong, political relations, party-to-party relations, subnational government relations. And I think that they also have similar value commitments, similar institutions, and they both would like, and they both participate in supply chains and a larger global economy in which they are interdependent. Each side needs the other to, like, you can't do anything in semiconductors without TSMC, but you can't do anything without Japanese semiconductor materials and machinery and other things, right? So they need each other to survive and prosper and build a stronger future. So that is a very sound basis for cooperation.
Yeah, but there's still some kind of inconsistency between Taiwan and Japan when it comes to trade, when it comes to imported food from Japan. Could you address a bit about that?
Well, food, agriculture trade is a problem not just between Taiwan and Japan, but Taiwan and the U.S. and other countries. Agriculture is always a problem in terms of trade. And then what has to happen, though, is, rather than looking at those difficult areas as being obstacles, I think both sides, including the U.S. and South Korea, have to look at how to build, resilient, secure supply chains for the future, and how to ensure economic security, technological security, security against economic coercion, widening ties to other market economies, ensuring secure digital connectivity, secure physical connectivity, through the global commons, freedom of navigation and overflight. These are all things that bring these countries together.
Okay, lately there has been a perception that both President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken are keen on mending ties with China. Conversely, with China undergoing an economic downturn, Beijing might be more open to dialogue with the West. How might this potential thaw in relations influence Japan's and Korea's dynamics with China? Maybe, Professor Yoon, your assessment.
Well, I think first of all, China is having an economic setback. If you are in the U.S., the hawkish group in the U.S., you say, "Wow, China is going the wrong direction. That's good for the U.S. and China will not pose the kind of threat. Maybe will follow the kind of Japanese, decline in the since 1990s. So the U.S. will maintain its hegemony. But at the same time, you find that U.S. government officials worry about, the economic implication of what China's decline might cause in the global trade or global market. So China, I think, just like you said, maybe Xi Jinping right now felt the heat that he wanted to be less hawkish and willing to talk to the U.S. and also to the rest of the world, especially, we have heard about Wang Yi's visit with Japanese foreign minister, Korean foreign minister. I think they also want to compete with the U.S. by forming, resuming the trilateral talk as well. So China, I think, is, especially after COVID, I think right now they are more willing to talk to the West, to the world now.
Do you agree with this assessment? Less hawkish.
I have a different take on this. First of all, you know, the BRICS summit is going to be starting very soon, within a matter of days, and China is going to make a big play there to create a sort of a counterweight to the G7. So clearly, political and diplomatic competition against the U.S. is continuing as the mainstream element of Chinese diplomacy. As far as trying to mend ties with China from the U.S. side, I don't think it's meant to, you know, go back to the past when, you know, Zhu Rongji was managing economic reform in China. This whole effort to establish a dialogue with China is about managing a peaceful rise for China, ensuring that it remains peaceful and that it doesn't turn coercive or even involve the use of force. So that's what it's about. It's about avoiding conflicts. It's about heading off problems that can be avoided, and you can't do that without dialogue.
So you would think that, you know, the CCP is going to, you know, kind of put a hold on the kind of conflict between U.S. and China, and maybe after that will be another conflict coming up soon.
I think Xi Jinping's Chinese dream agenda is unalterable, and I think it calls for a certain degree of not strategic partnership, but in fact competition and struggle against the U.S. So I don't think that element is ever going to go away, but we can at least try to maintain peaceful relations, and I think everybody wins from that.